So what I'm going to talk about today is the research setting in which the study that we are proposing, which is a series of actually 5 different studies, takes place. And then we'll talk about the theoretical framework in which we are using to situate the study, talk about the proposed study that I'm going to discuss today, and then we'll talk a little bit about the methodology, and I hope we have time for some questions and answers both during the presentation and at the end. So global basketball. How many of you would characterize yourself as either a fan of basketball or you're familiar with basketball? Okay, so we have a great deal of fan base here. What's interesting is when we look at the global basketball industry, which is part of FIBA, we find some interesting patterns that start emerging. With 214 national federations and hundreds of millions of registered players, basketball is truly a global sport. But within the 16 top leagues, based on the 2013-14 season, on average, 46% of players were classified as foreigners. And among them, and this didn't turn out to show as well as I'd like to be, there are 6 leagues that have more foreign players than national players. And 3 had a percentage of foreign players higher than 60%. So in Italy, Spain, and Germany, more than 60% of the players are foreigners. And the Spanish league we talked about is by far the most international national league. And U.S. players have a major role in EuroLeague and Euro Cup competitions. Significantly, they average more playing time and account for more points and rebounds per capita than any other player segment. And the National League's international regulations often allow a large number of players in different leagues and different nationalities, allow more players, foreign players than others. And so what we start looking at is the migratory balance by country. And you see what I would refer to as the 500-pound elephant in the room. And it's this right here. So you'll notice that the gold are countries that have a positive balance. The teal are those that have negative balance. So by far, the country that has the greatest positive balance, in other words, they are exporting players, is the United States. So we started to look at this, and we're also wanting to do this study with rugby, as well as American football, as well as baseball. So there's a series of studies that we're going to be conducting, and I wanted to sort of present it to you to get some feedback from an audience outside of the United States. So that was my primary motivation for coming here. On average, only 34% of foreign players played in the same country the previous season, and only 20% of them played for the same club. So you have what is a classic example, I think, of what's called oscillating migration. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, and we'll discuss that. So the U.S. international transfer activity is mainly based on exporting and re-importing players. So a player exports from the United States, goes to a European country, and then maybe comes back to the United States and re-imports to another country. So indeed, approximately 75% of players internationally transferred were U.S. players. So the U.S. labor market, or labor pool, is the actual oscillating migrant labor population that we're talking about. On a national scale, a majority of countries we showed had a negative balance. In other words, they import more players than they produce. But you can see in numbers, the U.S. has a total of 434 positive players in these top 6 leagues that I was talking to you about. So by far, the U.S. is exporting players abroad.
Is this the number by year?
Yes, in a single year. So you can see by the migratory balance by FIBA zone, Oceania has a negative 115, so Oceania is Australia, New Zealand. They're not producing or exporting players. Players are going into those areas. So you'll notice the only area that has a positive is the United States, basically, and that's the FIBA zone. Canada, which we always call U.S. light anyway. Thank you for the few Canadians in the room. Anyway, so the theoretical framework that I'm wanting to discuss a little bit here today is based on previous research that colleagues and I have been conducting over the last 15 years. Because for the last 15 years, I've been studying U.S. college sport, primarily football and men's basketball at the highest level, the NCAA, National Collegiate Athletic Association, what we call football bowl subdivision, or the Power Five, as you may hear it termed. So this is a series of articles that we've looked at, and the one that I'm going to focus on a good bit here today is a notion of comparing college athletes to company town workers, which company towns are towns that are reliant on a single industry. So it's our premise that U.S. college cities, towns like Bloomington, Indiana, is basically a company town because the university is the primary industry. And within that, most interactions on a large scale with the community and the university take place in the athletic setting, where you have 70, 80, 90, 100,000 people coming on to the university property to attend a football game, an American football match. So, profit athletes as oscillating migrant laborers is our premise here. So first of all, we have to define what a profit athlete is, and then we'll define oscillating migration and what that means to be an oscillating migrant laborer. So Mark Emmert, it was a really interesting experience. Anybody in the room heard of Mark Emmert, the president of the National Collegiate Athletic Association? Which is, so let me get some feedback. Knowledge of U.S. college sport, for those of you that are Europeans. Do you understand that the players do not get paid a negotiated salary? Everybody understands that? Okay. But they have what's called a grant in aid. So I was sitting next to Mark Emmert 2 summers ago before the U.S. Senate Commerce Committee, and this is what he said. For the vast majority of those who participate in NCAA sports, more than 460,000 young men and women each year at 8,084 institutions across 3 divisions and 23 different sports, the experience is exactly what it is intended to be, a meaningful extension of the educational process. So when we interrogate that statement, what is inherent in it? If you have a vast majority, what do you also have? You have a minority. So implicit in his statement is the majority is doing just fine, but the minority is getting screwed. And who are those minority players or athletes? So a profit athlete is a U.S. college athlete whose market value on an open market, open economic capitalist market, is greater than the cost of the grant and aid. So for example, very famous player Cam Newton just played for the losing team in the Super Bowl. I would mention that he was on the losing team that lost to the Denver Broncos. I am from Colorado, so let's make sure that we're clear about it. It was a fabulous game, and it will, anyway. Cam Newton, when he was in college, was alleged that his family accepted money or this or that or whatever. And it was termed $180,000 that Mississippi State was allegedly wanting to give him. So at least we know what Cam Newton's market value was. At least $180,000. But his grant and aid is far short of that. So he is by definition a profit athlete, as opposed to a loss athlete. A loss athlete is an athlete whose market value is less than the grant and aid. So if I'm a tennis player, I'm a loss athlete because I have no market value. I don't. So profit athletes as revenue generators. This chart is, I think, easy to understand. This shows the percentages of black football players, upwards almost to 70%, versus the number of students at various universities in the United States. Alabama, Ohio State, Boise State, University of Oregon, TCU, Nebraska, Florida, Oklahoma, Stanford, and Auburn, which was the top 10 at a specific time when we took this sample. So you can see that black football players at, for example, Florida, make up almost 70% of the population of the team. And that's, in addition to that, the number at Florida at that time was 90% starters were black. So who's generating the revenue? The black players. And interestingly, what we find is that the players have an existence in housing, training, advising, academic support, and socialization in which they are physically, culturally, and socially isolated from the rest of the campus community. Excuse me. So they are, by definition, a classic example of company town workers who are isolated as they used to be in the coal mines in West Virginia. So this notion of company town workers coupled with where players come from. So we know where football players specifically and basketball players come from, and many of them, not all, but many of them come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and they come from states in which the educational system in the United States varies, and the players that are going to college and producing the revenue disproportionately come from failed economic areas and failed educational systems. And go ahead.
So, the way you guys were...
I think they want the mic to forward.
So the way you guys were defining the profit athletes, you gave us the example of Cam Newton's, because Cam Newton's case was special where his allegation was revealed. So you were able to have some kind of his market value, objective market values, which is $180,000. But how are you able to define the pro athlete? Is that just based on the minority black players?
No, a profit athlete, the two best sources for valuation of player worth, Andy Schwartz, who is at Oscar, OSKR, out in San Francisco. Andy does a lot of this work. Dan Rasher, who testified in the O'Bannon case. Dan has done a good deal of valuation. Roger Knoll at Stanford has also done valuation. So our definition of profit athlete is based on economists' definition of their market value. And based on the amount of revenue that they're producing. So for example, Alabama, we know what their net revenue is because they have to do it on EADA reports and those kind of things, which is a little skewed, but at least we know that. Okay. So what we started thinking about is, what's the definition of an oscillating migrant laborer? And I owe a great deal of credit for this work to Dr. Billy Hawkins at the University of Georgia and his work in the New Plantation, where he did a lot of work on neocolonial migration patterns. So oscillating migrant laborers are workers who rotate for various periods of time between a family residence and a work site that has distinct cultural and social characteristics. So this oscillating migration, they go for a period of time, a fixed period of time usually based on a contract, and then they migrate back to the home site. And this existence is marked by cultural, social, and physical isolation. So we know, we know oscillating migrant laborers usually live in enclaves. And so they stay together, in other words. We also, when we start looking at the motivations to migrate, we can look at the migratory field, which would be economic issues, but we can also look at individual migrants' decisions and personal choices. And those are the players whose families are counting on them to have economic value added to the family site. And there's also structural constraints. The departure and arrival may be fixed by the employer that says we're going to employ you for 3 years, 4 years, 1 year, whatever amount of period of time it is. And it may be geographic proximity or a lack thereof. And we find that players that migrate further seem to have more homesickness and more issues because their family connections are weaker. The migrant network is really interesting too, because you have, in football and men's basketball in the United States, you have agents who have certain locations that they go in and recruit players from. And this agent interaction is very interesting. We can look at The other thing that's an interesting factor that we're wanting to take a look at is the cultural dissimilarity. So if they are in a cultural setting that's distinct either by language or by other settings, how does that interact with the players? And this language barriers may be another issue that we're really interested in looking at in the study that we're proposing, and or a desire to prolong their professional careers. So we're taking the work that we've done on oscillating migrant labor in the college setting in the U.S., which is interstate, and now we're wanting to take this and look at it on an international setting. Because we know certainly that there are migration patterns. So this area right here is the Los Angeles area is representing, and the players at University of Oregon and Boise State, for example, 54 players on the University of Oregon's team are from Los Angeles area in California. 38 go to Boise State. Same thing going from the Dallas Metroplex to Lincoln, Nebraska, and to Norman, Oklahoma. So like I've said before, the migrants oftentimes are from a lower class. They're of a certain ethnicity. They're from failed educational systems, and they come from localized enclaves. So that's an interesting factor that we know in interstate migration within the United States. So we're interested in seeing if these same patterns hold in global basketball and or in rugby and or in women's basketball and or in baseball, those kinds of things. So this chart shows you the epicenter of the United States and how the United States system increases migrant flows. And so you can see the larger migration goes into Europe, various parts in Europe, into Turkey, down into Australia, over into Russia, and going into Korea, Japan, et cetera, et cetera. So we're looking at this migration pattern, and we're wanting to see if they have similar characteristics as we've seen in other areas. So what our series of studies are going to be 5 different studies looking at football, rugby, women's basketball, baseball, and then men's basketball as well. And then the last area that we're wanting to look at is American football, and to see the migration from the Pacific Islands to the west coast of the United States to colleges and universities. So what we're doing now is data mining FIBA international team rosters, working with Uni Global and EU athletes. We're going to be looking at the 2015-16 season, looking at the U.S. players, the college they attended, whether they graduated or didn't graduate, and we will be using the federal graduation rate, not the graduation success rate. What was their major? What is their ethnicity? What was their career length as well? And we're going to be doing a series of semi-structured interviews with current players and former players. And we're going to be relying on gatekeepers. Gatekeepers are, for example, various players that we have contacts throughout the United States and in Europe. So one of the reasons that I'm here as well is to see if perhaps Germany or Hungary or other areas might be able to hook us into additional gatekeepers. Because what we're going to have to do is, we're going to have to do semi-structured interviews. And in addition to doing the socio-demographic data, we want to visit with the players to find out what their experiences were. So, wanted to get through that as quick as possible. I'd welcome any feedback or comments, critiques, suggestions for our studies.